Hello and welcome to the Heritage Foundation's Lehrman Auditorium. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to take the opportunity to remind everyone attending in-house to silence cell phones as a courtesy to our panelists and to those recording today's program. For those watching online, you're welcome to submit questions by emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting today's program is David and Sarah. He's the Research Associate for Homeland Security and Cybersecurity. And with that, I'll hand it over to David.
Thank you. Well, we all heard several weeks ago that the TSA was rocked by those leak reports that they had failed 67 out of 70 tests of their airport security. At airports across the country, investigators were able to penetrate TSA security with fake weapons and bombs. And this report is just one of many recent reports indicating that there are problems with TSA's technology, acquisitions, management, and personnel. In the wake of this news, some immediate changes were made, such as the replacement of the acting TSA administrator, and Congress is now rapidly moving toward confirming Coast Guard Vice Admiral Peter Neffenger as the next administrator. While these immediate changes might address some issues, the purpose of this panel is to discuss how the TSA how we can more significantly reform the TSA. Such reforms are critical because transportation is the lifeblood of the world economy. The ability for people and cargo to quickly move around the world furthers trade, cultural exchange, tourism, and many other opportunities. Security must not only keep passengers and cargo safe from threats to it, but it also must minimize the impediments to the free movement of people and resources. So our panelists are going to be discussing a variety of policy options, and so I just look forward to the discussion that we're going to have today. And so with that, I would like to introduce them all, and then we'll have them all give their remarks, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So first, we'll talk to Chad Wolf. He's the former Assistant Administrator of the Transportation Security Administration. He's currently a Vice President at Wexler and Walker, a bipartisan team of policy and political strategists. Chad brings with him over 15 years of public policy experience in defense, homeland security, and transportation sectors. As the former TSA Assistant Administrator, Chad was involved in developing regulations and security directives to implement the agency's programs. In this capacity, he worked closely with airline executives, airport directors, trade association leaders, and he regularly appeared before industry leaders whose operations were regulated by the TSA. At Wexler and Walker, Chad provides strategic guidance, policy expertise, and engagement execution to clients across the firm. From large corporations to nonprofits and issue-specific coalitions, Chad helps clients to develop and implement legislative and regulatory strategies to achieve their goals. Next, we'll have Han Nguyen, who was a former advisor at the Department of Homeland Security and current Chief of Staff at BSA, the Software Alliance, the leading advocate for a global software industry in the international marketplace. Nguyen serves in the U.S. federal government for over 7 years, focusing on issues including homeland security, trade security, and transportation security. Nguyen served 2 tours at the White House, including time with the National Security Council as the Director of Aviation Security. She held the position of Chief of Staff and Executive Advisor in the Office of Global Strategies at the TSA, where she spearheaded procedures and process improvements for the office and coordinated and advised on key international aviation security initiatives. As BSA's Chief of Staff, she serves as a key partner and representative for international external affairs, working with the President and CEO and the BSA leadership team. Nguyen contributes to the development and implementation of strategic policy goals for the organization. And then finally, we have Brian Finch, who's a partner at Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw, and Pittman in the firm's public policy practice. He specializes in counseling on regulatory and government affairs issues involving DHS, Congress, the Department of Defense, and other government agencies. Brian is a leading authority on the Safety Act, a federal statute that can provide liability protection to companies in the event of a terrorist or cyber attack. He's also a recognized legal authority on matters regarding cybersecurity and the legal and policy challenges associated with the consequences of companies suffering a cyber attack. Prior to joining Pillsbury, Brian practiced with 2 D.C. law firms and worked as a legal intern with the Office of the Chief Counsel of the Drug Enforcement Administration. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chad.
Great. Well, thank you, David and Heritage, for the invitation today. As a former executive at TSA, a lot of what I'll address today comes from my own personal experiences at the agency and the work I've been involved with in the last 10 years, representing various clients with TSA interests. So negative press and bad publicity is certainly nothing new to TSA. The agency, in my view, remains controversial, and with that comes very strong opinions on how it carries out its mission and its effectiveness. And so poor performance and low morale has really plagued the agency since its inception. So the question now is what's different? Why are we here, and why are we talking about TSA? And two things stand out in my mind. One, it's been 13 years since TSA was created, and so a lot of the growing pains should be behind the agency. A lot of the same morale problems and the same performance problems, I think Congress and the American public have grown tired of the same excuses. And so the question is, you have a $7 billion budget, why aren't we seeing improvements both in performance and security? And the second reason is you've got a number of high-profile incidents, the latest being the covert testing results that came to light. But before that, you had site of badge issues at San Diego, Atlanta. You had a groping case in Denver. You have a number of these high-profile incidents that's just shining a light on the agency in a very negative way. So I think now's a good time, sort of an inception or an inflection point in TSA's history. You have a new administrator. Hopefully, that will be confirmed very soon. So now's the time, I think, to take a look at a lot of different layers at TSA to see if what needs to be reformed and what not. I think it starts at the top. Leadership is certainly key. Everyone's talked a lot about leadership. We have a new administrator hopefully coming in. My view is that TSA needs someone who is very detail-oriented. It's an intelligence-driven organization. We've heard that a lot over the last several years, and that's nice. That's a good talking point. But for TSA, it comes down to execution and what occurs at the airport, specifically when we talk about aviation. So you need an administrator, and you need an executive team that understands the minutia of the airports, that is willing to get into the details of it, because it's how you execute at the checkpoint is what the American public sees and what the traveler sees. So I think that's key. I think they need to take a look at perhaps elevating the TSA administrator position to a 5-year appointment. Very similar to the FAA administrator. I think that takes a little bit of the politics out of it. But more than anything else, it stabilizes the agency. You've had 6 or 7 administrators in 13 years, probably just as many acting administrators in that time. And so I think the agency overall, the executive team, and even the folks at headquarters and in the airport, they need some stability. And I think that will go a long way. You also need to look at the executive positions underneath the administrator, specifically at TSA headquarters, and whether the current model is either you have airport experience or you have some type of federal security background. Is that the right model? Are those folks achieving what they need to achieve, or do we need different types of leadership at the headquarters level? I think it's all important to take a look at. From a congressional standpoint, I don't think there's enough oversight when it comes to TSA. There's been a lot of talk about DHS oversight, having too many congressional committees to report to. In TSA's perspective, I don't think there's been enough congressional oversight. This is an agency that needs a lot of oversight. It's still a young agency. A lot of other elements inside DHS, some are new, but others are old and have a history and understand the oversight role at Congress. I think complacency, no sense of urgency, this permeates throughout TSA at this time, and getting a strong congressional oversight, getting them more involved in TSA decisions and policy is a good thing. I think there needs to be a DHS or a TSA authorization bill. Outside of the appropriations process and perhaps 1 or 2 authorization bills a year, there's not a lot of direction that the Congress gives TSA except on an informal basis. So I think they need a lot of formal direction. I think technology is another issue, specifically as we talk about the checkpoint. I think a lot of folks are eager to look at screener performance and the role that the screener plays, specifically as we talk about covert testing and their poor performance. But what type of tools do they have in their toolbox? And what's the technology at the checkpoint that allows them to do their job? They have between 5 and 8 seconds to make a decision, whether to stop the belt and look at that bag or further pat down an individual. And do they have the right tools to make that decision? There's been a lot of talk about TSA's poor performance when it comes to technology rollout and managing that process at the checkpoint. And from an industry perspective or a technology industry perspective, they make equipment to meet specifications that TSA personnel make. So if those specifications or qualifications are wrong, I think we need to take a look at that process, whether that's through the TSL, which is in Atlantic City, or other elements that TSA uses. DHS, SSD is part of that process. But right now we have a magnetometer, we have a two-dimensional X-ray, and we have a whole body imaging at the checkpoint. And, my contention is we can do a lot better than that. We have state-of-the-art technology that screens checked baggage that goes under the cargo hold of the aircraft. You can bring that technology to the checkpoint, and it'll be dramatically different. And overall, I think the last point I'd like to make is just really a loss of confidence that the American public and Congress, I would say, has in TSA. This is an agency that screens 2 million people a day, over 1 million bags a day, and probably the largest part of DHS that interacts with the American public on a daily basis. And once you lose that you lose that confidence, it's extremely difficult to get back, and that goes to a big part of their mission. So I'm in favor of an independent organization, a blue ribbon panel of sort, to really take a look at TSA, specifically there at the checkpoint. It's sort of the last line of defense that we've all talked about, to make sure that they have, look from training to checkpoint, the whole, the management layers at TSA. I don't think, TSA saying, yeah, we've got the covert test results, we're working on it, we're fixing it. I don't think that works anymore. It's been 13 years, you're getting the same results. I think they need to do something a little bit more drastic, a little bit more different, and take a look at an outside group to take a look at their operations.
Thanks. Ha?
Great. Well, thank you for having me here today. I think the reaction to the IG report highlights that, there's a sense that we're not getting a whole lot of return on our security investments that we've made over the years. And, any way you look at it, 67 out of 70 is a pretty bad result. With the new leadership coming on board, I think this is an opportunity to look at ways, to improve. And I think we need to look at this in a bit of a broader context of, what is it that what are the goals that we're trying to achieve here, and how do we kind of best do that? So, if we started from a baseline of, we want 100% security, then that would just mean shutting off the airports and, not having an aviation sector, right? And that is not the reality of where we're starting from. So the reality is the public expects to be able to travel in a somewhat facilitated manner. And what that means is that you have trade-offs. Like, these are all the trade-offs that we're talking about. It's between security, it's between facilitation, it's between, business competitiveness, ease of use, privacy, right? So every decision that is made on how we implement security processes across the board at TSA is about, has to take into consideration those different aspects of what we're dealing with. So in a world of limited resources, how do you best do that? It's about focusing your resources on areas where you can have the biggest impact on mitigating the risk. So this is kind of the principle that is behind risk-based security. At a high level, what that means is that the agency needs to be flexible enough to adapt to kind of a quickly evolving threat environment, and align itself, against that. So technologies, its procedures, against that changing environment. And there are some challenges to doing that, to be sure. They are facing an operational environment that is moving and changing at a very quick pace and at a quick tempo. And the processes on the other side are, lengthy and very kind of regulatory based, and just don't keep up with that tempo. On the kind of legal and congressional side, there are some laws that are very prescriptive, and those exacerbate, the agency's inflexibility. So any law that is, requires 100% anything requires a massive level of investment in technology that could quickly become, obsolete in the next few years. But, they've made that investment and they have to meet these congressional requirements. And that, I think, is not helpful in terms of being responsive to a changing environment. Also, TSA, based on kind of the way it was set up, is also a very kind of compliance and regulatory-oriented type of agency. What does that mean? That means, when you're a compliance-based agency, you do inspections, you look at whether people have the right, fences up, and then implementing your procedures the right way. But you're not measuring, in essence, if you're actually getting more security based on your security protocols, right? So there are some opportunities here. I would say that there's an opportunity to apply risk-based security more broadly. TSA PreCheck is one way that it's done that, where it's kind of focused its screening resources at the checkpoint on people it knows less about, while facilitating those that it already has, background information on. But I think that could be broadened, right? How does TSA deploy its FAMS operations? How does it what technology does it invest in based on the threat environment? How does it maintain flexibility? How much does it focus on identifying bad things going through the checkpoint versus the bad people with bad intent? Those are all questions that I think need to be grappled with. And lastly, how do we measure effectiveness? How do you incorporate real metrics in the way you operate to make sure that you are measuring that you're actually getting the security returns that you are investing in? So what does that look like? It's not just a compliance-based system, as I mentioned, not like, do you have a fence up? Do you have enough people there at the checkpoint? But it's the type of testing, red teaming, where you have teams that go through and try to simulate being the enemy and seeing if they can get through. And those results will show you, that detection rate will show you whether or not you're being effective or not. And those numbers and those results should be then folded into how do you improve your processes, how do you better train your people. And that cycle, I think, and that whole culture shift would be something to look at. And then lastly, on congressional oversight, to your point, Chad, about more congressional oversight, I think they need a different type of congressional oversight, which is kind of driven or focused on the results that we are gaining from these investments. How do you show that you are actually catching the bad people? So saying that that there have been no major attacks since 9/11, like that is, one measure, but the true reality of measuring your security would be to look at whether or not, through your testing and all of that your security measures are actually catching the things that you want them to catch.
Thanks, huh? And finally, Brian.
Great, thank you. Thank you, David, for inviting me today. I really appreciate it. Appreciate being a part of this rather august panel as well. I'm going to learn as much as anyone in this room today from Ha and Chad, so I appreciate the opportunity to be up here. I was listening to an interview of all people of Jon Stewart the other day, and Jon Stewart was talking about before his Daily Show career, he was a stand-up comedian. And he said one of his big moments in his stand-up career was that he got to perform at the reopening of Radio City Music Hall in New York City. And he was really excited and told all his family and friends to come and watch. And he said there were 6,000 people there, which is the capacity of Radio City Music Hall. And he went out and started to do his stand-up. And as he was doing it, he said he got absolutely no reaction from the crowd. He said it was just dead silence as he told every joke. And his comment was, you have to work awfully hard to get 6,000 people not to laugh at one time. That's an incredible level of failure. And that stuck in my mind as I thought about the TSA. While the TSA apparently got 4% of the people, that still is an awfully hard and an awfully significant amount of work to fail that much, particularly at one layer. And as Chad and as Ha mentioned, it really is stunning at the end of the day that something that is so visible to the American public and is such a high priority. I mean, after all, when we think about it, the reason for the TSA was a direct reaction to 9/11 and the events that led to the terrible events of that day. And for that agency, after 13 years and $100 billion, to have probably its most visible last line and very essential layer of security to fail at such a high rate, where essentially you're no better than random luck at catching people with prohibited items, is really just, there's something fundamentally wrong with what's going on at the Transportation Security Administration. And I want to be clear and I want to be fair to the TSA as well. I mean, it's very easy to bash the TSA. We all do. We all go through the airport and we have various thoughts, many of which are not pleasant, about the screening process. But, I do think that the individuals within the TSA, from the administrator on down, do have really the best intentions in their hearts. There's no malice aforethought when it comes to what they're doing, or there's a lack of belief in their mission. And they really do want to protect the American traveling public. I mean, again, after all, if something goes wrong, regardless of whether it's their fault or not, they're going to get the blame. And so I don't think it's a question of whether people aren't interested in their jobs. I mean, there may be issues with day-to-day road operations for TSOs, and anybody who has a repetitive job, that's an issue. But there's something fundamentally wrong with how the TSA comes up with its priorities and how it implements its actions and how it deals with contractors and the screening public and how it implements security measures, that you get to a point where a layer of security, again, probably the most critical layer of security, fails that much. And you can make all excuses you want regarding, well, there's multiple layers of other security and that these are super, red teams, that they know everything, et cetera. And so they are likely to penetrate the security a good amount of the time. That's true. And over the years, these red teams have been able to penetrate the airport screening level on a fairly regular basis. But at 96%, there's just something wrong. And that's, as Chad was mentioning before we started, that's something that, is a dramatic leap from years past. And really, one of the reasons why I'm on this panel is that over the years, I've dealt a lot with the TSA, in particular with the program that the public and many in government aren't necessarily aware of, but is a really interesting program, is what's called the Screening Partnership Program. And that's a program that was in the actual Aviation Transportation Security Act, which established the TSA post 9/11, and that's a program that allows the use of private screeners at airports. And it's a program that is easy for opponents of the private sector and people who believe that they're inherently governmental functions. It's easy for them to attack it and say, this is just a way to go back to the pre-9/11 mindset where it's the lowest cost and minimum wage workers checking your bags, et cetera, and why would we want to have private sector screeners when we could have government trained employees? And obviously this is an administration that believes that anybody who is employed by the federal government is obviously going to do a better job than someone in the private sector, and I think we can all agree that we would argue that point. But point is that this program does exist, and it gives the airports the opportunity to request from the TSA administrator that they no longer have transportation security officers, federal employees deployed at airports to conduct security screening. Instead, a private company would come in and do that work. And this is one area where, as I mentioned, I've spent a lot of time looking at it. I've been heavily involved in it in a number of fashions. And it is a very important solution, and I think a good alternative that may address a number of the issues we're talking about here today. But it's also an excellent example of how you have to dig deeper than just a surface level reaction with respect to how do we fix this, and it needs to be fixed, because this isn't just about replacing one-for-one federal screeners with private screeners. If you really want to implement the SPP the right way, this program, private sector screeners, you have to remember that the TSA is still going to be very intimately involved in the actual screening process and the oversight. And so if there are fundamental problems at the mid-level management and at the senior level management within the TSA, moving in private screeners is going to help, but it's not going to be necessarily a complete solution. As Chad and Ha mentioned, this is something that requires a fundamental reexamination of what is happening within the TSA. And just to give you a few facts with respect to the Security Partnership Program, to dispel any misbeliefs about what the program is or is not. Again, this is not a program where private sector companies can come in and pay minimum wage to airport screeners. By law, the private sector screeners must be paid an amount no less than what the federal screeners receive. So their overall cost, including benefits, et cetera, must be the same as what the federal screeners. So there goes argument number one, that you're going to just replace workers with lower wage, people who aren't as motivated. Secondly, again, as I mentioned, that these are basically screeners. These are the front line, but TSA maintains overall control of security at the airport with respect to the policies and the procedures, particularly as related to security. What the companies can do, though, are two things that I think are critical distinctions and will probably make an immediate difference. Number one, they can fire people pretty quickly. If people are underperforming, these aren't unionized employees, although they have the option to join a union. It's a private sector company, and so the process for terminating underperforming, screeners is a lot easier, and I think that's a good motivation to do your job well. And the second thing is that, again, they also have the ability to innovate and do things that the TSA may not necessarily think of, or it may take a longer time for them to implement. One example is that there are SPP companies out there that have developed their own pre-employment screening systems. So that they can do a series of physical exams, essentially, of tests to see how people will handle the repetitive stress of moving luggage and carts, et cetera, and use that as a predictor for disability claims. And the companies that implement this have had actually 0 disability claims over the years that they've been operating versus a higher number, which is 1 and more than what you see with TSA screeners. And they also have developed their own algorithms, which I think people in this room would appreciate, in that they can predict where crowds are going to surge at different checkpoints. And so they are able to move their workforce a lot more efficiently, including by gender, so that there isn't a lack of female screeners and male screeners at one given gate, so that it takes a longer time and it holds up the line. And it shows that their throughput is actually much faster, and to the extent we know about their performance, which is classified information, we know it's roughly equal to what the TSA screeners are. So there's that element that I think is very important to look at. But this is one of those programs that TSA has worked awfully hard to hold back the SPP over the years. There are anecdotal stories about approaching airports and saying it really wouldn't be a good idea for you to apply to opt out. You really should keep TSO screeners, and how are airport directors supposed to respond to that? TSA has taken traditionally a very long time to approve applications from airports. There was a 3-year period where no airports were approved for using the screening partnership program, despite having a number of applications in the hopper. And there have been more instances where airports are now approved under the SPP, but they continue to be smaller airports, and they're not the major airports where I think you could see some of the more significant differences. And really, what's been very interesting too is that there's been subtle but active ways to undermine the SPP. The largest of which is that the TSA is functionally transforming the program from what's known as a best value contract, meaning who's going to give you the best performance at a reasonable price, to what they call lowest price technically acceptable, meaning we're going to set the minimum barrier and then we're just going to go with the cheapest company. And that, again, is setting up the SPP for failure as well, because you're just basically saying, well, look, a company may have been doing this for years, and they really know how to do this work, but because this other company can offer it for $50,000 less a year, we're going to give it to them because they are simply the lowest price. So that's not the right way to go with respect to the TSA SPP program. 2 other things I'd just like to mention really quick as well. In light of the OPM issue with respect to cyber attacks, I do think it is worth rebutting the point that it would be unusual for terrorists to know everything about a particular layer of TSA screening. I think that the ability of a foreign nation state and capabilities of a foreign nation state are actually fairly translatable to non-state actors when it comes to cyber offense. The ability to get into TSA computer networks and actually see plans, schedules, et cetera, for security, that worries me. I think the federal government has proven that it is not very good at managing its own secrets and protecting them from prying eyes. And so I do not agree with the comment that it's hyper unusual for someone to know that much about TSA operations. I think if you had a determined foe, they would be able to figure that out pretty easily. And finally, again, just a larger point is that Oh, and actually, I'll make this my last point, but, I do applaud Secretary Johnson for coming out fairly forcefully and taking the actions of replacing the acting administrator and issuing a number of immediate action items to be undertaken with respect to reforming security procedures following this latest report. But if you've been in this town long enough, and shockingly and sadly in many ways I've been in this town almost 20 years, you start to see things appearing over and over again. And the comments from the secretary and the action plan for the secretary is something I could have seen in 2003 or in 2005 or in 2007, 2009. It was just fundamental, sort of the fundamental mission of the TSA, and things that you would think they would be doing the whole time, such as, well, we're going to make sure that everybody knows the vulnerabilities, and so we're going to train all our employees on these threats. And then we're going to remind the FSDs and the security managers of all their roles and priorities. And I'm personally going to go visit all the security equipment manufacturers to make sure they have a stake in what's going on as a partner in aviation security. Those are all good, and those are all things that need to be done, but that's baseline as far as I'm concerned. I think if we're going to have a more effective response from the Department of Homeland Security at the secretarial level as well as at the new administrative level, there's really got to be more than aviation security or transportation security 101 as your fixes. And if we don't get beyond that, I think we'll just wind up in the same place again in a few years.
Thank you, Brian. We have microphones right here. So open up to the audience. If you'll just state your name, your affiliation, and if you could please try to ask a question within maybe 2 sentences or so, that'd be awesome. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask a first question to anyone, but I know how you address TSA PreCheck. I just wanted to ask, I know there's been some talk about some of the folks who have maybe have gotten through PreCheck who perhaps shouldn't have, things like managed inclusion or the rules that are written. I just want to know if you had any thoughts on the way that the TSA is administering PreCheck and whether it ought to be done differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the principal level, it's the right approach. I can't really, speak in detail to how they've implemented it and the different programs that have, different ways in which they've kind of expanded PreCheck. But that again is to the point of, TSA can come up with all of these ways of doing things and being more efficient and focusing resources on the right risk. But again, you won't really know if you're being effective until you kind of constantly test that system and kind of have those results feed back into your cycle of like what your security procedures are and what you're training your folks to do. And so, again, that is in my mind kind of one cultural shift that needs to happen, and that should happen across the board, right? So, I think TSA PreCheck is great from a traveler's perspective, but I think, in terms of that security principle, but again, you need to be vigilant and constantly test it because you need to make sure that it's still working against an evolving threat environment.
Thanks. All right, do you have any questions from the audience?
Thank you. Hello, Karina Rollins from the Heritage Foundation. And I ask this question not in my heritage capacity, but as a concerned citizen. I think it seems like a lot of potential reforms that you mentioned could be helpful, whether it's more or different congressional oversight or a new administrator or privatization, even though I remember horror stories that I could tell you from the pre-9/11 days. So I don't think the private way is like a cure-all. But here's my thing. It seems that all of these, even no matter how successful, all of these reforms that you mentioned so far seem that they would be entirely peripheral for one reason. And Ha touched on it. You said that 100% security is not possible. But it seems that is exactly or 100% of anything is not possible. But it seems that is the fundamental problem with the TSA approach, treating literally every single person who walks through that gate as an equal risk. right? It was in 2003 or 2004 when Norman Mineta was asked on 60 Minutes, do you literally think that a 12-year-old Girl Scout should be treated as the same risk as a 25-year-old Middle Eastern male? And he said yes. Isn't that the problem, that the TSA, and if it were a private group, the private group would have that approach? Isn't that the problem, that we are trying to do a 100% approach? And isn't it truly time for some terrorist profiling, perhaps, along the way, along the lines of how the Israelis do it?
I'll take a shot at that, and you guys jump in there. I mean, I think what we've seen from TSA over the last several years is RBS, risk-based system, risk-based screening. And so they like to, they will, I think, argue with you a little bit, saying that they don't do a 100% screen everyone, that they look at different types of individuals coming through that checkpoint. And we can debate on whether that's effective or not. What I've always said, whether at TSA or not, is security is a filter and not a guarantee. And that's really fundamentally what it comes down to. I think there's a different perception of what TSA views as security and the American public views as security. A 0% failure rate is really what the American public expects out of TSA. And to get that, you'd shut the system down. The lines would be 40 minutes long, and everyone would be an intrusive pat down. They'd dump everything out of your bag, and nothing would get through the system. What we've seen is that's unacceptable. The Israeli model is unacceptable here in the U.S., which is profiling, which is extreme pat downs. TSA tried to implement that 4 or 5 years ago. Congress said, no, absolutely not. TSA said, well, I've got a security gap. I need to bring in technology. And the question is, does the technology work? I think that's still debatable. And so I think there's a number of things there. But, I mean, to answer your question, TSA is trying to move towards that risk-based security model, which is we don't treat everyone the same going through that checkpoint. The problem with the checkpoint and the problem with TSA is there's different layers of security, and if one fails, the other ones will sort of pick it up. And this is a phrase that I didn't coin, but I've read it, which is TSA is intelligence-driven, but it shouldn't be intelligence-dependent, which is not every bad guy is going to show up on a watch list. Not every bad guy is going to fail pre-check. Some are just going to show up at the airport, and when they do, that checkpoint system has to work. It's the sort of the last line of defense. And when you see almost 100% failure rate, something is fundamentally broken at the agency. And so whether it's risk-based security, whether it's pre-check, whether it's the technology, I think they've got to do a sort of top-down, up-down approach to their checkpoint operations.
The only thing I'd add to that is, I generally agree with that. I would note too that however you want to phrase it, profiling or risk-based, et cetera, that is still not a 100% guarantee in and of itself. You look at all the incidents of self-radicalized individuals who've conducted attacks in the United States over the past few years. They slip through the cracks of law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And so I don't think that profiling, it may improve in some way, shape, or form, but it's also not going to get you to that 100% effectiveness or 0% failure rate.
Exist, right? What we want is improvement, isn't it?
Right.
We know 100% doesn't exist. We just want significant improvement would be nice.
Well, that's true, but if you're also looking at what we're talking about here at this point, again, how do you get to a 96% failure rate at a screening checkpoint? We're not talking about something on the margins or a 20% improvement. I mean, we're talking about really a near 100% failure rate with people who are armed with some intelligence. And you would think that just by measure of luck or random screening elements, you would at least be, under 90% failure rate. So there's something beyond the intelligence and how we screen the personnel that's fundamentally wrong with that layer of security. And we've got to dig into that. And it's time for, I really think it's the culture of TSA in many ways. It is not a harmonious family. Let's put it that way. With 56,000 employees and lots of management, et cetera, I'm sure everyone who's sitting up at this dais can talk about stories about infighting between different elements of the TSA, whether it's the program office versus the procurement shop, et cetera, with different priorities, and one doesn't listen to the other, et cetera, and that undermines the mission. And so there is an element of there needs to be some fundamental reforms within TSA as well as throughout the Department of Homeland Security about implementing leadership and accountability throughout the entire organization. So that there are clear lines of command and that there are clear consequences for not implementing effective measures.
One important thing I wanted to say that is critical to risk-based security, right? And so you can focus your resources on the highest area of risk, and you can prepare the traveling public for as much as you can, so that they know what to expect when they get to the airport and they know what the procedures are. But you have to maintain a certain level of unpredictability in all that you do so that people cannot game the system, right? And so that's a really important aspect of all of this. We can be transparent, and we can kind of, make sure that everyone knows what to expect. But again, to get to that effective risk mitigation, the enemy can't be fully, aware of everything that's going to happen and what the security protocols are going to be.
Thank you.
We're going to go there and then there.
Yeah, hi, Brian Zimmer from Keeping Identity Safe. In a previous life, I was an investigator for House Judiciary Committee, and one of my interesting side jobs was I worked for Sensenbrenner. He'd always ask me whenever I traveled to set up appointments with the screeners in foreign countries. So whenever I traveled, in one case I traveled to Canada, drove the Canadians nuts because I set up arrangements and then my Canadian shepherds from the embassy were going crazy because I was all over their vulnerability points with a couple Canadian points of contact. And one of the things that struck me at the time was that our own TSA did not choose to look at any foreign models except the Israeli because of the security relationship. And there was nobody in the office at TSA that was assigned to be active with foreign security counterparts. And because of that experience, and because they would always say that to me when they'd say, oh, you're the first American that has come here. Who you represent? I say, oh, the Congress. Sometimes I'd been colleagues with me, associates, if they were cleared from bipartisan type little groups, and we'd all be fascinated by how the Italians would criticize our security, the French would criticize it, the Germans, and they would point out how they were doing what they thought were superior, and how absolutely resistant TSA was to deputations from the European Union group. They'd say, hey, they didn't want to hear it. They did not want to hear it. Now, at that time, TSA was led by former Secret Servicemen. Since then, we've had a whole series of people that I think have been spectacularly unqualified in terms of their personal backgrounds to be leading a screening organization because they've got no experience with screening, which is what TSA does, and the current nominee is no different. He's never screened anything. So what's he doing running it? So my question to the panel is, don't you think that some job qualifications might be suitable when you consider nominees for being in charge of the world's largest screening organization, maybe some experience with foreign countries? You contrast that, Disney would never hire anyone to run screening at any of its Disney facilities that had never done screening. They would not do that. Why do we do that?
Can you take a shot? I think it's a good question. It goes back to my earlier comments about leadership at TSA, and I think in the past, several of the past administrators have really been not detail-oriented. They've been talking about intelligence-based, risk-based. That's good. How you implement that is all that matters at TSA. How that works, because you're running a 45,000 screener workforce. So making sure that you understand how that workforce runs and operates. Look, there's not a lot of other workforce like that. So to get that specific skill set, I think is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to recruit them to TSA. This is not a job that people are lining up for.
Management.
Right. And so that starts at the top. The next level of management, again, as part of my comments earlier, I think needs to take a look at. The model has been airline security, airport security, just because that's what TSA does, aviation. The question is that the right model? And so I agree with you. I think another type of skill set needs to be looked at.
But my point is that foreign aviation security runs more efficiently in most cases with countries from Russia to Japan to Korea. Israel is not a good model, okay? But
I think they all have their pluses and minuses.
I went through the Jordanian Amman airport system twice, and I will tell you that they are far more selective, clever than anything
The
I've
issue,
seen in the United
the
States.
issue with the U.S. model is the scalability. It's just the vast network, having 450 airports that you're having to manage and oversee versus a handful that a lot of other countries have. They're able to devote a lot more resources to individual airports. So I think the scalability becomes a real issue when we talk about, hey, let's model it after another country or another agency overseas. I think you can take best practices. I think you can take improvements, but the scalability is really the issue.
And to your point about best practices, I came from there. The Office of Global Strategies at TSA is the arm that looks at working internationally to kind of coordinate on security practices and look at best practices. And I know that they're very engaged in the International Civil Aviation Organization as well, which is the international standard setting body. And so, they have people in, I think it's like 30 different countries where, they are the diplomatic arm of TSA to engage on security practices.
One thing I would add, more as a comment than anything else, is that there is a precedent with respect to implementing qualifications as a statutory requirement for the head of a particular agency. I mean, we've seen it with FEMA and we've seen it with ICE, I believe, that there were statutory changes requiring a background in whether it was emergency management or in law enforcement for those personnel since 9/11 and since the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security. So the precedent is there if Congress so wanted to change the law such that the TSA administrator had to have certain qualifications, whether it was with respect to screening or other skills as well. I think a good question to ask, though, is whether the performance of those two agencies that I mentioned, ICE and FEMA, actually improved after those requirements were implemented, or if it was simply it looks good, but did it actually change day-to-day operations? And then you could really get to the fundamental issue, which I think many of us encountered, is that it doesn't necessarily matter what the qualifications of the administrator is, whether he or she, if the White House is telling that agency how to do things and the administrator is more a filter from orders on high and then implements them below, then it becomes a question of, is this really a priority for the executive branch in the White House? And I think that, it's something that falls on the shoulders of senior level management within the administration, more so than the TSA itself.
And just to make one comment, sort of build on that, and also sort of address the international piece. You mentioned Canada and other nations, and we were talking about privatization before, SPP. Most countries in Europe and Canada use a privatized screener system, so they're doing quite well using that system. So it's definitely doable, and it's something that if we want to learn best practices, but that's an example where perhaps from on high there's some resistance to implementing something which really is desirable and used by most of the rest of our partners and allies around the world. So, you had a question.
Hi, I'm Andrew James. I'm an intern at Senator Hatch's office, and I'm not an expert on these issues, but I have done a lot of research, and it seems like a lot of people are claiming that it's a lack of I guess the failure of the technology that we use, especially those really expensive big machines that are supposed to detect these bombs and everything. And I've read a lot of reports on some different kinds of options for the TSA security checks, including K9 units. Recently, I went to the White House, and instead of any kind of technical machines or these big expensive things, they just had a dog sniff you down for 5 seconds, and that was the most effective thing. And I've read a lot of reports saying those kind of those kind of screening checks are a lot more effective than these big expensive machines. So what is being done right now, or what are different options that you see viable? Maybe not the K9 unit, but as far as the technology that we use, because from what I've seen, it's not necessarily all the fault of the employees. As far as also, a big fault goes to the technology that we use.
Yeah, it's certainly. I certainly believe that you've got to give them the right tools to do their job, and right now they don't have the right tools. So you mentioned K9. TSA has a K9 program. There are limitations with K9s. A, they're expensive. They're expensive to maintain, but B, they can only operate for so long. So TSA's checkpoint is unlike the White House's checkpoint or other checkpoints. It's in constant use. There are constant people going through those checkpoints for perhaps up to 19 hours a day. And so you've got to have a system that is going to be constantly used. And I think technology, I think K9's a good supplement to that. I don't think you can use that alone, or you can't profile by itself and get rid of technology. I mean, there's still a fundamental purpose of that checkpoint, and technology is part of it. And we've got to figure out, what's the right way to acquire the technology? What's the right way to pay for it? Are there innovative financing options so that it becomes less of a hurdle for Congress and the appropriators to continue to allocate so much money towards TSA? They allocated a lot for checked baggage, and then they kind of sort of got tired of it. And when it came to the checkpoint, it's sort of, they give you a little bit each fiscal year, and TSA's had to deal with that. And I think TSA's had to make a hard choice, which is, we'd really like the very best technology at the checkpoint, but we don't have the budget for it. And so we're going to get the very best with what we can afford. And I think we're seeing vast limitations with that technology right now. I think it's a two-dimensional X-ray. And so is that giving the screeners a good enough view of what's in that bag in that 5 to 8 second span? Probably not. Are the whole body imaging or the AIT machines, are they working? Again, I think that's what's going to come out of this, the red team testing or the covert testing of where are the limitations at that checkpoint. And once you identify that, then you can say, is technology the solution, or is it a training issue, or what? I think we're all guessing until we see a little bit more of the results.
Yeah, I think that kind of line of thinking is right, is not kind of focusing so much on what technology is out there, but like what are the needs, and how quickly do we need to be able to respond to it, and not kind of getting so fixated on a technological solution that will probably require a lot of investment, and then not maybe keep up with the evolving threat.
Yeah, and there's also been a history of TSA having some rather spectacular failures in innovative technology investment as well, where they've spent significant amounts of money and had to basically warehouse huge amounts of equipment because it just proved not to be effective. And so they may be a little bit gun-shy, but again, it also calls into question their ability to select the right technology and set, as Chad was mentioning at the Transportation Security Lab and other locations, the right criteria for what is considered to be effective for those technologies. So ultimately, there's anyone who tells you there's such a thing as a silver bullet is a liar, particularly when it comes to technology, and so it's always going to be a mix of personnel and technology.
Any other questions?
Hi, James Greathouse with Transport Canada. I appreciate Mr. Finch's opinion on the security partnership program, and I'd like Ms. Nguyen and Mr. Wolf's opinions on it as well.
Sure. Go for it.
I think for the SPP, I think in an ideal world, this is what it would look like for me. I think you kind of overhaul the SPP a little bit. Right now, the requirements are very constraining, and they end up in kind of similar costs, maybe same return on security and all of that. So you're not seeing a whole lot of difference between the two different models. I think if you are able to kind of create a more competitive environment where you're giving the SPP a little bit more room to flourish, and then you can kind of match that up with making sure that they're performing by showing actual results, and that creates a competitive environment, then maybe you'll drive more security at the airports, right? And you're infusing a little bit of kind of the private sector model into that. That's what I think would be good.
When I think about the SPP program, I think the number one issue for my perspective is getting the FSD at an individual airport out of the job of managing workers. Right now, they are focused on making sure that enough checkpoints have coverage, scheduling issues, complaints, employment complaints, injury complaints. That's their job, and they have to focus on security. And so the benefit that I see for SPP is actually you get the FSDs out of that, and their number one job is security, and that's what they think about day in and day out at that airport. And you let the private screener contract manage how they hire, fire, employ, injury rates. Let them deal with that, and let TSA focus on security. So that's the benefit that I see of an SPP program.
I think we have time for one more. If there's any other questions out there? No? Yes, you can, Jim.
I really didn't have one, but since there's time. Could you guys talk about the breadth of the other more on the breadth of the other TSA missions and this balance about what they should or shouldn't be? Maybe should they dump the other missions and just be more focused on this, or should they? Because they never get much discussion, right, on the other modes. And I'd just be interested in your assessment of what they're doing and what they should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've heard a lot of folks refer to TSA as the Aviation Security Administration, and that's what their budget is geared towards. They have the fundamental difference, obviously, is in the aviation mode. They have boots on the ground, so they have a workforce to manage, and up to, I think it's $5 billion of their $7 billion is screener pay, compensation, and training. And so the other modes are strictly regulatory and oversight. And so again, it comes back to SPP. Do you want TSA to have that regulatory and oversight role in aviation the way it does in some of the surface modes of transportation, or do you want boots on the ground? I'm, of the opinion that I think there's some expertise at TSA in the other modes of transportation. Is TSA the right place for it to reside? I'm not sold on that, at least when I was at the agency. I mean, there was always, everything is aviation, and yes, we have to do this because this is our mission, but it's not given the time and attention that it deserves. And so I think there's a real debate there.
I think that's, as Chad mentions, that's a real healthy debate. And, when you're talking about TSA's role with respect to rail security as well as pipeline security, et cetera, I mean, they are actively involved in those areas, but certainly not to the extent, budget, or the visibility that they are with respect to aviation security. I do know of instances where they have what they call these Viper teams, these visible intermodal something teams, which they basically, they're heavily armed TSA agents roaming around, whether it could be on the rails or sometimes in airports to show their capabilities. And there are instances where the TSA will work actually with critical infrastructure, particularly at large-scale public events, where the TSA will assist with screening, if you can believe that, with metal detectors and such, where in an event where you're going to have 80 or 90,000 people showing up at one time. So they do have these other missions, but it is, number one, those missions aren't going to go away. It's not as if DHS is going to suddenly stop with respect to rail or other types of security. So then the question becomes, well, where else does that fit, and would it be a good fit, or would it still be an afterthought in those other agencies within the department? And then I think secondly, regardless of how much of the focus is on aviation security versus rail or other modes, again, at the end of the day, when you get to a point where you have such a high failure rate at one high-profile level, it's an indicator that there's something going on that's fundamentally wrong within the agency, and regardless of the mission, regardless of the scope, et cetera, it's awfully hard to be that wrong that much of the time. And so there's got to be something that really needs to be looked at in the DNA of the Transportation Security Administration to see what exactly, after 13 years, are we just missing completely, and how do we remedy this?
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Brian, that, the question is, where else might it be a fit? And I just don't know, in what other agency would make sense to have transportation security fall into. And to the point of, high failure rates in the aviation sector, yes, we do need to take a look at that, but it's not about throwing all of the money at the problem. So that there probably is, some room to step back and look at how much we're dedicating to aviation for what return on security, and do we need to start investing more in some of the other areas.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us today. If you are interested in more on this, there's a publication outside that we have Heritage has on some of these issues. So thanks for joining us.